Welcome. My name is Sharon Rutherford, and I am Head of Workplace Risk for Honan Insurance Brokers. I have over 15 years experience in the workers' compensation industry and currently oversee a team of specialists where we provide collaborative support to our clients across the workers' compensation program. Honan as a whole provides a full range of commercial insurance and risk financial solutions to businesses across a wide range of industries and has expanded from Australia-wide to New Zealand, Singapore, and Malaysia. Certainly, we are proud to be able to host this webinar, where the aim is to provide some key insights to the Dreamworld findings, which will be delivered by Cameron Clark, Director at Verus. So just a brief bio on Verus. They're a professional health, safety, and risk management consultancy operating across Australia. Verus provide a wide range of WHS services across culture and leadership management systems, auditing, including self-insurance and risk management. Please check out their website and you'll be able to find out a lot more about Verus, including some great case studies from some of their key clients across retail, transport, manufacturing, and freight retail, to name a few. Certainly, Honan view Verus as a key partner in cross-collaboration of our services, so we're very proud to be able to support them as they deliver these findings. Now, just before I hand over to Cam, there is a Q&A opportunity, so please send them through as any questions come up. But certainly at the end, we'll hopefully have enough time to have a Q&A session at that point as well. So without further delay, I'll hand it over to Cam. Thank you, Cam.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Honan, for giving us an opportunity to work with you guys and to share some insights we gained as part of an engagement to review the findings of the Queensland Coronial Inquest on behalf of a client. This presentation is a continuation of the work we performed on behalf of a client, and it's been tailored to suit I guess a broad range of industries and a broad range of circumstances rather than this individual client. Now just let me share my screen and we can continue. So today I just wanted to go through a few different items in relation to the Dreamworld incident. Firstly, I'm going to give you some insights into the actual ride at Dreamworld, talk about the specific events that occurred on the day. Then we'll delve into the factors that the Coronial Inquest found contributed to the incident occurring, as well as contributing to the tragic consequences in relation to failings around emergency response. And then we'll look generally at some of the key learnings for organisations and what they can do to prevent similar circumstances within their organisation. Just a very brief history of the ride. It was based on a 1979 design from another amusement park and was constructed by Dream in 1986. Over the course of that near 40-year life, various modifications had occurred that were initiated and completed by Dreamworld. The ride itself is made up of a number of different components, so to speak. Some of the key ones that I think are important to understand during this presentation is the trough, which effectively was the river that these rafts would travel down and travel through the rapids. There were also some trough support rails that were in place just below the waterline that helped to prevent the rafts from dropping to the bottom of the trough if and when the water system, the water levels dropped. Those water levels were maintained by a pump system of a north and a south pump that returned the water as it had followed gravity down the river and returned the water back up to the top of the system. Equally, there was a conveyor system that returned the rafts from the bottom of the ride to the top of the ride where patrons would alight, and then the rafts would move around to a loading zone for new patrons. And there were various operator controls as well in place that controlled the functions of the ride. We'll get into the detail of how these are important in the context of the event as we go through. But very briefly, this is a aerial photo of the Thunder River Rapids ride as it appeared at Dreamworld. It is no longer a ride at Dreamworld. It's been decommissioned and removed. The yellow just shows the journey of the rafts. Effectively, the rafts would commence down here and travel around this, this river course until it got to the bottom. And you can see here this sort of hatched line here. This is the conveyor that returned the rafts back up to the top of the ride. And this is just a bit of a blown up version which shows you the conveyors as they drag the rafts up. You can see the support rails here, this sort of ladder structure here, and the parallel circular lines here. That's the support rails that sat within the trough. Over here was where the loading zone for new passengers were. They would follow it around and they'd be unloaded at this location. You can also see the north and the south pumps. These are the outlets from the pumps as they dragged water from the bottom of the trough back up to the top, and these would generate the flow down the trough. And I thought I'd just highlight as well very quickly, this is the conveyor. The raft, you can see at the top of the conveyor here, and I point out that just some of the slats here, you can see there's a long slat and there's a couple of short slats before another long slat. So this is important just in the context of some of the failings that were identified in the inquest as we'll go through. So very quickly though, I think it's important that we just reflect on what happened on the day. At 10 a.m. the ride opened. It had opened after various pre-starts and checks that were required on a daily basis. Opened at 10 a.m. on the 25th of October 2016. At about 2 p.m, raft number 5 was boarded by 6 passengers. That was Cindy Lowe, Kieran Lowe, Kate Goodchild, Ebony Turner, Luke Dorsett and Roozi Araghi. They loaded into the raft and they went around the watercourse with no incident at all, and they were picked up by the conveyor at the bottom and were returning to the unload zone. At some point during that journey, the water level in the trough dropped dramatically due to a pump failure, and that was identified later as the southern pump. Raft 6, which had been travelling in front of Raft 5, it had made the journey up the conveyor. It had come off the conveyor and patrons had left that raft. However, in the course of all of those activities, the water level had dropped and Raft 6 now sat stranded on the steel support rails at the conveyor exit. Raft 5 continued to travel up the conveyor before, as it tried to come off the conveyor, it struck the stationary Raft 5, and because of the nature of the conveyor, it struck it multiple times. The multiple strikes caused both rafts to start to pivot upwards, but Raft 5 lifted completely and inverted from a horizontal into a vertical arrangement before dropping down into a gap between the conveyor and the support rails, and got stuck in the mechanism of the chain-driven conveyor. 2 of the passengers, Ebony Turner and Kieran Lowe, were able to escape. However, Cindy Lowe, Kate Goodchild, Luke Dorsett and Roozi Araghi were trapped in the raft and in the mechanism of the ride. It is terribly unfortunate that emergency response was unsuccessful and all 4 of those individuals passed away at the ride. The total time, and I think this is indicative of just how quickly something, an unexpected event, how quickly from an unexpected event things can go tragically wrong. So from the time the pump failed to the time that the raft number 5 was inverted and drawn into the mechanism was just 1 minute and 17 seconds. So not very long. This is a photo of the incident site. You can see Raft 6 is still stationary on the support rails here. Raft 5 is in the location that was found by police and the coroner. You can see here it's dropped between the end of the support rails, and you can just see here the chain of the conveyor. So you can see how closely, how tragic those 4 passengers, tragically those 4 passengers got trapped in the conveyor mechanism. So just quickly bring up this again, you can see here that this is the incident site that we've just spoken about. You can see these support rails and you can see the small gap from this image between the support rails and the conveyor. So in analysing the findings from the coronial inquest, there are 300 something pages, so there is quite a lot to digest, but we believe there's 4 key themes that really fall out of the inquest, and they are around governance and assurance, around management system and procedures, in particular training and competency, and those programs at Dreamworld at the time were found to be inadequate, and particularly plant and equipment, its design and its modification over the course of its life were found to be major failings. I will move through these quite quickly because I do want to allow some suitable time for questions and answers. From a governance and assurance point of view, the coronial inquest found that senior management really didn't understand just how high risk some of the attractions and rides at Dreamworld were. As a result of not understanding how risky they were, many of their governance and risk activities were not commensurate with the level of risk that they needed to manage. They had poor programs of audit, they had, which were poorly designed and didn't give them the information they wanted to. They knew that they were inadequate and they allowed those audit programs to continue. There was also certainly some failings of senior management in they didn't effectively inquire as to what was going on in their organisation. And I suspect that they were deficient in their due diligence obligations under the WHS Act. There were various examples of specific legal obligations around plant equipment and plant equipment maintenance that didn't meet the requirements of the regulations or suitable relevant Australian standards that relate to plant design and the use of amusement rides in theme parks. There was also certainly a very poor accountability for health and safety tasks within the organisation, with many parts of the business thinking it was other people's responsibility to perform health and safety tasks. Ultimately, no one really knew who was responsible for what. And whilst there weren't very many good audits or good risk assessments undertaken as part of the Thunder River Rapids ride, those that were undertaken, there were many examples of recommendations that weren't actioned. Now, some examples of some of the recommendations, and these particular items will become relevant as we move through the presentation, but emergency stops, integrated emergency stops were recommended but rejected on 4 different occasions over the course of the life of the Thunder Rivers ride. Similarly, automatic water detection, labelling of control panels for plant equipment, and simplifying emergency procedures were recommended on many occasions throughout the course of the life. But for one reason or another, it was decided that they wouldn't proceed with them. Now, we'd like to understand why they didn't proceed with them, but other failings that were identified by the coronial inquest included document and record management, both of which meant that many documents and many records, including justification for why particular improvements weren't progressed, were simply not available. And the recollection of individuals was quite poor, with many unable to recall why particular improvements were or weren't progressed. There were also some serious findings around the failings in their incident management and their risk management processes. From a systems and procedures point of view, they found that there was no document control and no effective records management systems at the site. What that meant is that the departments, which also already operated in silos and had very little understanding of what other departments did, they were able to develop documents and procedures that impacted on the other departments without any consultation or input from the stakeholders. The result of this is that it was very difficult for anyone in the organisation to understand the full history of the Thunder River Rapids ride and their risks. I think there was a one of the general manager of safety indicated that he was not aware that there had been any incidents at the Thunder River Rapids ride during the course of its life. And as we move on, we'll see that there were many examples. So there had been various incidents that had occurred on the Thunder River Rapids ride, and there were many that were directly relevant or comparable to the incident that occurred that took the 4 lives. This included rafts banking up together in places that weren't expected. It included rafts striking each other at the end of the conveyor, as well as passengers being ejected from the rafts into the water. Throughout the course of those incidents that were reported, they were investigated on various occasions, but the findings very much focused on the behaviour of the operators and whether they followed the correct operational procedures. Where there were engineering controls that were recommended, many times they weren't actioned. And there was a real failure here to interrogate just how good the procedures were and the activities that were asked of operators during all of these incidents. And ultimately, I think those latent conditions had continued all the way through to 2016. The key factor here is that they simply didn't learn some of their lessons. And as an example of that, and I apologise for the poor quality photos here. These are original photos, on film that have since been scanned. And you can see here, and these are all the same incident, and these are in exactly the same location as the fatal incident that occurred in October 2016. These are 4 rafts that have come off the conveyor, and for one reason and another, the first raft has gotten stuck, and 3 other rafts have now impacted on that stationary raft. You can see the stationary raft has not moved much, regardless of the 3 rafts that have banked up. This incident was reported and it was investigated, and the outcomes of the investigation said that there was 0 chance that rafts could bank up and strike each other in this location whilst there were passengers on board. So they completely dismissed any opportunity to learn the lesson from this particular near miss and make changes and improvements to the ride to ensure that this wouldn't happen again. They simply evaluated that there was 0 chance that this would ever occur with patrons. From a systems and procedures point of view, around risk management, there was very poor risk management assessments undertaken. In fact, whilst they had done some assessments in various locations across the park, it wasn't comprehensive. Equally, at the Thunder Rivers ride, there had been no single assessment undertaken covering the entirety of the ride. And whilst there had been some narrow focused assessments at certain locations at the ride, these were often done by people who weren't qualified, who were unqualified or incompetent in terms of risk assessment techniques. From a training and competency point of view, some of the key findings from the Coronial Inquest was that the operator training for the ride didn't align with their responsibilities. They hadn't performed a formal training needs analysis and understood exactly the competencies that operators would need to have in order to operate the ride safely. And because the responsibilities of different types of operators were largely interchangeable, many times operators hadn't received training in the duties they were interchanging with. Operator manuals did include emergency instruction, but there was very little detail covered during training on what to do during an emergency event. And that was partly to do with the fact that the people giving the training did so in their own way. And it was, there was very little system or structure to the training that was delivered. And as a result, different operators had different focuses within their training. The training didn't include practical emergency scenario and focused more on the sort of standard evacuation for a general emergency. And there were limitations on who could actually initiate the emergency response. So there were multiple operators, but only the most senior operator was authorised to initiate the emergency response. Other operators would have to alert the number 1 operator in order for emergency response to be initiated. And of course, in an emergency, time is paramount. To give you a bit of an idea of how the training didn't align with operator duties, I just wanted to bring up this slide very quickly. So the number one operator, which was the primary operator, versus the number two operator, which is the secondary operator. Number one operator would typically be at the load station, loading passengers on board, and the number two operator would typically be at the unload station, but they would interchange. This is a list of the responsibilities of the number one operator, and so they have primary responsibility for supervising other operators. They have to load and unload guests. They're responsible for guest safety. They have to monitor the guest queue and the patrons in the queue, making sure there's no one underage, for example. They have to visually monitor the water level in the trough to make sure it hasn't dropped. They also have a control panel where they have to monitor the performance of the pumps that are working with the water level. Through various CCTV cameras through to a screen near the loading zones, they had to monitor guests on the ride, monitor the conveyor and the rafts. They had to check the rafts were coming in good condition and make sure that the tubes had suitable air pressure. There was a whole range of obligations that these guys, as a number one operator, would have to deliver. Now, the training for the number one operator lasted about 8 hours. The training for the number two operator lasted about an hour to an hour and a half, even though many of the activities and the responsibilities were exactly the same. I think it's also important to remember here that during peak times, the number one operator and the number two operator, with all these duties, only had 35 seconds between each raft to perform all of these tasks. So it's taken me about 2 minutes just to explain them. It takes a lot longer to actually perform them. From a plant and equipment point of view, this is where some of the very direct failings were identified. Whilst this is a single ride that appears on the surface to be one system, it is in fact two different systems that operate completely independently. So you have the water system with the pumps and you have the conveyor. There's no integration automated between these two systems, and it's really the operators that needed to integrate the system manually. Hence, they needed to monitor water levels. Hence, they needed to monitor whether the conveyor was working and all of these kind of things. There were no systems to integrate, and there were no warning alarms or warning lights that told them when things were going wrong. Most importantly, there was no single emergency stop that would shut down the entirety of the ride when one part of the ride went wrong, either automatically or through operators hitting the emergency stop button. Whilst hitting the emergency stop would certainly stop the pumps, that emergency stop wouldn't stop the conveyor. Whilst there was an emergency stop for the conveyor in a different location, hitting that wouldn't stop the pumps. And that was found as one of the key factors that led to the incident occurring. On top of that, there was no automatic water detection feature on the Thunder River Rapids ride, even though such a feature on other water-based rides at Dreamworld were considered critical safety controls. Equally with the design, there had been a number of modifications over the course of its life. The conveyor slats that I showed you before, where there was a single long slat and two short slats before another long slat, that had been modified over the course of its life. Originally, there was only long slats on the conveyor, and it's thought that the modified conveyor slats may have enabled the raft to be more easily dragged downwards. Equally, there was a modification undertaken at some point in the life of the ride that changed how empty rafts would be managed. And it's felt that that modification resulted in a large gap between the support rails and the conveyor. And again, more easily allowed that raft to be dragged downwards. Importantly, through the modification in this plant and equipment, there had never been an assessment of whether the modification would introduce further risks. And that was a major failing identified by the Coronial Inquest. Equally, from a maintenance point of view, the original design and construction some 40-something years ago, the maintenance checklists were still based on that original design and original construction. The checklist hadn't been updated to evolve with updates to Australian standards or original equipment manufacturer guidance, or simply just industry standards. And there were also findings in the inquest that showed that the annual inspections performed by qualified people of amusement rides wasn't being routinely undertaken, and Dreamworld had instead found a way in their head to justify why they could do it another way rather than performing it in accordance with the WHS Act. Equally importantly, and certainly something that perhaps led to the incident occurring on the day, was the breakdown procedure wasn't consistently understood by everyone involved. There was various understandings of whether the ride should be shut down after twice failing or after 3 times failing within a 24-hour period. The established breakdown procedure was for 2 times. On the second time, it was to be shut down. Now, during the course of the week leading up to the incident and on the day, the south pump had failed on 5 separate occasions, and it had already failed twice on the same day. So the ride should have been shut down in accordance with the breakdown procedure. However, they didn't have good training protocols to make sure everyone understood what the requirements were. Instead of shutting down the ride, they tried to investigate where the faults were and couldn't find what the fault was. Or what was causing the fault. They simply reset the system, which reset the pumps and allowed the pump to continue, and they restarted the ride. And they repeated that again and showed the operator, rather than the maintenance technician, how to reset the system so as to make sure the ride could continue for patrons, because it was a very busy day and it was also a very popular ride. So very quickly, this is just a summary of what went wrong. So we had an organisation that really didn't understand what their risks and legal requirements were. As a result, they weren't able to effectively inquire whether they were meeting them, and they didn't design their assurance programs to inform them effectively. They had poor systems that made it really effective to understand what was going on, and they didn't learn their lessons when incidents did occur. There was a severe lack of automation and a lack of integration between the plant systems, and there were poorly considered modifications throughout the lifetime of the plant that seems to have introduced a number of additional hazards. Their inspection and maintenance regimes were inadequate and didn't meet legal requirements. They misunderstood their breakdown procedure. And as a result, they had normalised these plant faults as a nuisance, one that could be fixed through resetting rather than one that actually had a safety impact. All of the lack of automation, lack of integration had an over-reliance on operators keeping the conditions of the plant safe. And as we saw, there's a number of failings around training, not being aligned to responsibilities, and not giving suitable time for staff to be trained in those quite comprehensive responsibilities. So what can we learn from it? Well, I think from a governance point of view, senior management and executive management need to make sure that their governance arrangements are well designed, that they're commensurate with the risk of the organisation, that they're independent, and that findings are followed through, and where they aren't, there is suitable justification for why they didn't. From a systems and procedures point of view, I think the current practice is to make sure that systems and procedures drive proper cultural improvements, and to do that you'll need, the systems need to be integrated. They need to work across the business and have different parts of the business interact. They need to make sure that there's suitable resources available to properly implement the system, but also make sure that it's not just designed to align with what we expect to happen, but also that there's suitable resources to evaluate and understand what has happened when things go wrong. Also an opportunity for organisations to make sure they use risk effectively to inform organisational decisions. If you're not using risk as a data point in your decision making, there's a number of safety related impacts that could continue in your organisation unintentionally, as well as making sure people are properly trained and qualified to perform their tasks. From a training and competency point of view, or further from a training and competency point of view, I think it's really important that training programs are based on a formal assessment of training needs rather than an ad hoc assessment of the kind of skills that people have. We need to make sure that training programs consider emergency response, particularly when there are duties of employees or team members that include emergency response. We need to make sure that complex training has suitable time to deliver the messages and make sure people are competent. And we need to make sure that those who provide training, who develop training content and assess competency of individuals are working from the same song sheet so that there's a structured, systematic approach. From a plant and equipment point of view, we really need to make sure that the designs and maintenance programs have kept pace with legal obligations, what happens within industry, and of course, Australian standards. I think the idea that it was built in 40 years ago and is still suitable to be operating today is a complete fallacy. Are your plant systems, including emergency systems, integrated, or do they rely on operators to manage that integration? If we're modifying plant, are we completing a risk assessment to make sure we're not unintentionally introducing other hazards or new hazards? Do we have robust breakdown procedures that everyone understands and problems are fixed rather than ignored and simply become business as usual? And are we asking operators of plant and equipment to manage too much information whilst they're trying to operate things safely? So I think I've very quickly given you a brief rundown of the coronial inquest, but I'm happy to ask any questions or answer any questions you may have or ask.
Thanks, Cam. That was really great. I don't know about anyone else, but if you can imagine the mind blown emoji that's kind of happening with me right now. Certainly some key issues there, isn't there? So there is a question that's come through. Given the findings from the Dreamworld Coronial Inquest in relation to a lack of good governance practices, how does this impact on boards and executive teams, particularly with the introduction of industrial manslaughter legislation across a number of states and territories? Pam.
Well, probably firstly, I'd say the Queensland industrial manslaughter laws weren't retroactive, so certainly Dreamworld as a organisation and the senior officers there wouldn't be subject to the industrial manslaughter prosecution. That said, industrial manslaughter results from senior management through their action or inaction, resulting in the death of an individual when that action or inaction would be regarded as grossly inadequate. In relation to this, I think Dreamworld, the individuals at Dreamworld, would probably be hard to establish which of their actions or inactions directly led to the deaths here, but certainly the PCBU would certainly be found liable, I suspect. But beyond that, what organisations can do, I think, is as they try to understand what their particular whether they have these kind of risks, is to make sure that they are following through with the normal due diligence requirements, which is making sure that you have knowledge of your organisation and what's happening, making sure you understand the risks and hazards in the business, making sure that there are appropriate resources with to deliver on the requirements of your system and to control risks. So there's a whole range of things we have kind of touched on here that will help boards and help organisations effectively govern the risks in their organisations. I think one of the key points, though, is to make sure that the further you are away from the activities of your organisation, the more difficult it is to make sure that you know what's going on. You're very much reliant on understanding, getting information from internal people and being able to make an assessment of how independent that is, as well as the external, potentially external programs that do deliver you independent sort of information that you can then use to validate the information you're getting from internal sources.
Yes. Now, you referenced PCBU, just for maybe people out there, what does that mean in context to?
It's a, under the WHS law, it effectively replaced employer. It stands for person conducting a business or undertaking. It's basically saying, it's trying to capture all of the potential types of organisations or people that may perform work.
Okay. Now, there's a question that's come through from Peter Blatt. Would it have been a different result if the two riders in the front raft did not get out of the raft, as far as, I guess, the findings might have referenced?
The inquest certainly didn't indicate that those kind of things may have contributed. I think whether there were people in the raft or not, it's highly likely, you know, the south pump would have still failed, and that raft would have still become stranded on those on the support rails.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I do have a question, and I think moving away from the Dreamworld event as a whole, I think for you as a WHS expert that goes into a lot of different businesses and industries, certainly there's some key findings where just, you know, what could go wrong did go wrong at all levels, through basic, you know, failings of human errors. But what are some of the common themes that you see when you do go into organizations, if there is a common theme of basic failings that a lot of organizations get wrong, if there is a theme, or does it vary from organization to organization?
Well, look, I certainly think you know, incident management and incident investigation, you know, can be a time-consuming activity. I certainly think there are opportunities for many organisations to better learn from incidents that occur in the workplace, rather than thinking that it's not a data point or a warning sign that needs to be listened to. I think for the safety people that might be out in our audience today, when we look at case studies for major industrial disasters, we do tend to find a common theme being the warning signs were simply not listened to. So I think, you know, that was certainly shown throughout Dreamworld, that there were definitely warning signs that could have been listened to on multiple occasions from multiple sources. And had they done so, it's very likely that this incident wouldn't have occurred. I think it's also worth saying, you know, the inquest said that had there been automatic water detection coupled to an integrated system that would automatically shut down the conveyor when the pumps shut down, that this incident would not have occurred at all. And the cost of those two automated systems was estimated at about $12,000 or $13,000. So we're talking about a relatively small sum of money, which would have ultimately led to 4 lives not being lost.
Fair enough. Now, a good question that's come through: how could Verus assist on this matter, or, you know, providing more preventative or post-incident support?
So we've got a couple of things that we can do if people are needing help. We have some ICANN investigators, myself included. So certainly if there is an incident and you want to be sure you have learned what you can from it, performing a proper incident investigation is going to give you better data than not doing it. I think as well as in terms of from the front end, you know, we have a very strong self-insurance auditing background. That information is regularly presented to boards, and we present to boards regarding the findings and how risky these things are. So certainly having a well-structured assurance program, which we could help you design and deliver, would be some of the things we could definitely help doing. Help those out there to avoid these kind of circumstances.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much for that. Certainly that's a good segue. I mean, we're coming up to just on 45 minutes, which I think is a perfect timing. So thank you so much, Cam, for this. This was very insightful. I've certainly taking and jotting down some key insights and considerations moving forward in what we need to look out for with our clients. Certainly for people out there, if you do need support in your policies and procedures, or there's questions that you have identified or are still trying to digest it and do want to come back with further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Cameron Clark through Verus, and we'll do what we can to sort of send out maybe some of these questions as well, and maybe some more insights as a follow-up to this webinar as well. So look, if there's no further questions, we'll let everyone else go and hopefully have a lunch break if you weren't eating through the webinar. And we do hope that you found this to be a useful, insightful webinar, and certainly something that we hope we can continue to deliver more of in the near future. So thank you all, and thank you, Cam.
Thank you.
Goodbye.